good morning, just, I guess, for you guys. And glad to be with you today. Apologies because I gather I'm the only heathen speaker speaking in English to you. But my German is definitely not up to this to deliver it in local. So hopefully you find the discussion interesting. So just a bit of context, I guess. Let me just get my slides working. So Fosway is an industry analyst. We're based in the UK, but we are researching a lot of topics around next-gen HR, talent and learning across Europe, and for quite a long time. I set up Fosway 25 years ago, and our clients on the corporate side are typically European headquartered multinationals, DAX organizations or FTSE 100 or the EMEA end of global companies. And because for 25 years of looking at digital HR, digital learning and so on, these often were the very early adopters of these transformational kind of approaches. And then obviously as the market becomes more mainstream around that. You also might know us because we publish quite a lot of trends research, some of which I'm going to cover today, and also assessment of the main vendor supply options for European companies. We're actually very interested in the German and wider DACH marketplace because of the obviously German economy being such a big economy within Europe. We've always had engagement from some of the larger multinationals, but we've also, over the last 12, 18 months, started to drill into the market at a slightly more local level as well, and I'll talk to you about that a bit later on, etc. So our kind of topic today really is kind of an interesting title, which is like the boom time opportunity in some ways around digital learning. And from our research, what we call our digital learning realities research over the last 5-10 years, we've been tracking this discussion around the digital transformation of learning, and this has been one of these things where almost everybody has been in progress, right? So most companies have started this process, but very few have actually completed that transformation. And then overnight, the COVID pandemic comes along, and we follow staff, or in the US, we fire all the staff, and then they rejoin again, and massively have changed, obviously, the whole landscape around learning with people working from home. I see all of you sat here today attending, sort of sat in your home or home offices generally, and engaging with this. So this has become, obviously, a massive normality over the last, particularly 12 months. And it's something that has forced organizations, and I'll be very kind of positive really around the way in which particularly corporate L&D has had to respond to this, to literally overnight change to be able to reach out and change the way it delivers a lot of activity to people working from home and so on. One thing I'll say is there's lots of data in the slides I'm going to give. I've got too many slides for 20 minutes, but the slides will be available afterwards. So by all means, screenshot them as we go, but also you will get access to the slides afterwards anyway. So overnight, the COVID pandemic really changed the whole landscape. And there's been a huge kind of response to that in terms of what organizations have had to do. 94% we did some research in the summer of L&D professionals reported to having to change their strategy. Well, that's not a massive surprise. If they were running classroom training-based exercises, they pretty much stopped immediately. 2 in 3 we talk about making significant changes in terms of their strategy. And if I look at it from an activity level point of view and an investment, you saw a massive swing, away from obviously face-to-face training delivery and into online. And, we've seen big growth in terms of around things like services, to get content online, and platforms, etc. as well. And, a consequential big reduction in external spend around face-to-face training. And, this is all very obvious. The thing which is interesting is has that been done very well? right? So it's fine to run basic classes in a virtual classroom. Take something you might have run face-to-face and now deliver it for a virtual session. But is this actually an effective learning mechanism? And I think ultimately, to come back to the premise of this session, is how do how do organizations do this really well? What's the opportunity to really up the game here? Because having made this transition, we're very unlikely to go back to where it was before. The demand from learners has massively increased. I mean, we talk to, obviously, as part of our research, we work with a lot of the vendors in the market. I'll come back to that at the end. And we're tracking what they're doing. Most of the vendors have seen a 200% to 300% increase in utilization of their platforms. That's existing customers massively consuming more content or more of their services into their things in order to respond to this need. And that demand obviously is led by learners themselves. It's also led by the organization that fundamentally had to pivot and change the way it was going to do delivery. So there's been a huge shift around that. And we've seen obviously utilization of lots of parts, lots of different learning solutions in that. One of the biggest things, so Zoom literally became an overnight phenomenon across the planet. Very few people had heard of it before, and suddenly it became a household name. People were running their gymnastics classes over Zoom. They were running all sorts of, all sorts of different activities and so on, and it became a household name, really. This is an example where obviously you've seen a massive shift around the use of virtual classroom technology, social platforms, the LMS, of course, as a vehicle to deliver lots of content, and then other aspects as well, other kinds of technologies. So these are the kinds of things that people were being used. And what we saw was that in our research, 21% of organizations had actually put in new solutions or expanded licenses. That was very common, that you've seen a significant increase in the number of licenses that organizations were increasing, or they were pushing more content. As I said, on average, we would say anecdotally a 200% to 300% increase in utilization of digital platforms from the vendor perspective. So huge things. We also saw a number of companies rush through, even by maybe June, July, companies had to go out and buy new stuff in order to be able to deliver this stuff and meet these needs. So there's big changes. And I think one of the interesting underlying things here, which is really, really important, and I'd ask you to think about it. Doesn't matter what side of the fence you sit on, whether you're a corporate organization consuming this stuff and trying to meet the needs of your employees, or whether you're a consultant or a vendor in the marketplace. At the end of the day, the one telling factor was that companies that knew what they were doing, had higher maturity, found it a lot easier to respond to those changes. So organizations with a mature digital learning strategy were twice as likely to say they found that transition easy. And if you were the other way round, you were 3 times more likely to find it to say that it was difficult. Right? So the maturity of somebody's digital strategy was really important. And I think what's interesting, particularly looking a little bit maybe at the German marketplace, which has tended to lag other markets like the US or the UK, maybe Scandinavia, around the adoption of some of digital at scale as a key strategy for delivery. That means that obviously by definition, whilst it might be more thought through, often the maturity level of organizations was lower. That is a huge opportunity if you are looking at how you kind of accelerate your capability into it. So if that's kind of talking about the impact that the pandemic has made, where are we going, right? And obviously the key message here is simple: we're not going back. At the end of the day, that a lot of those changes have happened. Even if we return, I think from a personal point of view, there's a lot of hype around what's going to happen in terms of offices and marketplace, and everybody's going to be working from home in the future. Clearly, some organizations have taken this as an opportunity to change their workplace model, particularly knowledge businesses, okay, and white-collar environments. Much harder to do if you're a retailer or a manufacturer or so on and things like this. But we have certainly seen a shift, and from from an overall perspective, this strategy has kind of changed sort of forever. So again, similar from our research, only 5% of organizations thought that they would go back to a model closer to what it was before. We've actually updated this data more recently. That number's dropped even further. It was down to 3% in some research that we did earlier this year. The majority think that a lot of these changes will stick. And I think if you think about where we are in terms of now, supposedly what is a post-pandemic scenario, we're not post-pandemic. Reality is still having massive impact. We're seeing countries in Europe still going into lockdowns and so on and things like this. The reality is with that and the oncoming economic, because remember, from an economics perspective, lots of companies have been insulated from the worst damage of this because of what the government spending has done. The opportunity, to how this will change and flush out in the future will continue. This will still be a dominant factor. So we don't think it's going to go back to the same. We don't think it necessarily it's clearly not going to all stay as online. What I would call lowest common denominator. Here's a course, run it. Here's a virtual session, attend it. We need to think about how we do things in a much more effective way, particularly running a high-performing culture, business and culture online or virtually is really a lot harder to do than just running some basic things to keep the lights on in the business in the short term. So this is one of the things that we need to see. The other factor which is really important is, here's some research looking at, do we think those things like our learning platforms are fit for the workforce anyway? Lots of organizations say no. Right? So 65% of organizations in our 2020 research said that their existing systems were not fit for purpose for their workforce already, and that was before the pandemic happened, and has accelerated that. So there's lots of changes required for that. There's also, one of the things the learning industry has become rather besotted by is talking about things like learning experience, sometimes often in a very superficial way. But obviously, one of the things we're also trying to do at the same time as responding to all those other challenges is to up the game in terms of the experience of learners and the outcomes that we create. 92% of organizations saying that this is important or very important. So this is clearly, the traditional approaches to digital, maybe the more click and turny learning content and LMSs which were designed to support compliance and administration. Fundamentally, that game is over. We have to fundamentally change that as well. And we're doing this within a much wider context or world where learning is very diverse now. We're talking about many contexts and strategies, many approaches to delivery. The highest growth area in terms of response from the pandemic was the use of video within learning, right? The use of created content and assets. So there are lots of strategies. We're moving away very fast from that traditional pattern of delivery that L&D typically had about where it ran courses or events. It's interesting in talking to often companies in Europe, they talk about e-learnings as if it's a kind of thing, right, rather than an act or whatever. That habit of delivery L&D has to change. And we have to be able to understand how this supports not just basic performance orientation, basic compliance needs, but how it builds strategic capability as well. This is a huge opportunity because for a lot of organizations, digital has not been a main strategy to build strategic capability or to drive organizational agility. These are things that we need to now do. And the other thing that is coming through really loud and clear is this is not just learning activity for its own sake. Learning is part of a much bigger continuum here, and in particular, 84% of organizations, L&D leads are saying that they need to integrate their digital learning into their workplace, into their collaboration platforms, into Teams, into Slack, into whatever it is. The idea that learning is something separate to work is fundamentally wrong. And we need to understand how we surface that in there. Again, this is an area where when you come from a course mentality, it's really challenging to understand how you make that transition. from a learning strategy point of view, let alone from a technology strategy point of view as well. And again, that is a huge opportunity for us. This trend will not go away. Since this slide was created, for example, Microsoft announced its Viva platform to look at embedding knowledge and learning and stuff within the Teams environment much more explicitly. So there will only be more demands for this going forward. How does that all impact the vendor landscape? So my last section here in the last few minutes is really just thinking about the impact this has on the learning, the vendor landscape and the solution options. I'm going to show you what we call our Fosway 9 grids, which are our assessment of the main vendor supplier options for larger European companies looking to transform and deliver these kinds of solutions. From a digital learning provider point of view, so these are typically companies that are more content and service-led. One of the interesting things, and it's sort of summarized in the headline on the right here, is almost everybody now is a digital learning provider. They kind of had to be. It doesn't matter where they were, whether they were a consumer of it, whether they were a training company, whether they were already in the digital market. Everybody had to be a digital learning because it was the only game in town. Everything else kind of stopped. So there's been a really pivotal role and shift, as we talked about. But a lot of what was done initially was what I would call lowest common denominator. It was actually just keeping the lights on. Can I run a basic thing or push out some content that keeps somebody online and engaged? Right? Fatigue is absolutely overtaking the organizations. And I'm sure from a personal point of view, you even probably feel that when you sit into Teams after Zoom, after whatever meeting, seemingly every hour of the day. It just overtakes your ability to do it. So we've got to really address this and think about how we do this in a more sophisticated way. From a learning platforms perspective, the other thing is that anybody that we kind of created a myth in the industry that LMSs were bad things, right? That everybody hated them and that their need was out of date. And we had to then buy things like e-learning experience platforms. And as we said, we're slightly besotted around that learning experience outcome. One of the things that we realized from a Fosway point of view, we've been tracking this for a long time, was that anybody that basically who was a vendor that didn't want to be seen as an LMS called themselves an LXP, regardless of what they actually did. This was very confusing for buyers and very confusing. It was a marketing term only. And in many ways, as a concept, didn't really make sense as being a separate platform layer. So one of the things we did last year is we spent most of the last year, and we're still actually in the end game of this, is deconstructing what that experience means, and looking at the specialism areas, looking at AI and mobile and social and adaptive and all these kind of things that came under that, and actually looking at what they really mean. And that's resulted in us reanalyzing the way we talk about learning systems a lot. We talk now about modern learning suites and disruptive specialists. This was a change we actually made last year, but in some ways the research has just further recategorized and moved that on even further. So again, from a supply option point of view, how are you responding to that? That's actually the 2020 diagram. I apologize for that. It's out of date. We've got a 2021 version of this. But how do we rethink to respond to that and look at the solution options? How do we disrupt? But actually, how do we think about that as part of a modern ecosystem? So those 9 grids, the research data I've shown you, for us, this is obviously the thing we do in talking about the market. It's just the tip of the analysis iceberg. Obviously, from a Fosway perspective, we also can use those tools, that data, to help organizations. We get asked a lot for our opinion to help people assess their options, validate what they think they might want to buy, and accelerate into looking at vendor choices, etc., because we have that insight, obviously, around the market. And at the end of the day, we don't have a vested interest in what solutions you pick or even whether you do it or not. The research I've talked about is all available on the Fosway website, and including the 9 grids and also the the trends research that we talked about, COVID and so on. Scarily, this is also available for you in German, so you don't even have to listen to me speaking in English. All of the main reports, all the main things are available in German too. Unfortunately, I can't join you for your networking session, but Sven Elber, who's our one of our analyst team, who's based in Germany, is actually attending this morning and will actually be in the networking session. So he'd be very happy to ask you questions. I did intend to try and do the close in German, but I kind of bottled that. So apologies for an English-only presentation. Thank you. I hope you found it interesting.